I'm Jeremy Till, and this is Amplify. It was a pleasure to have Matt Grashord join us today, share with us his vision and creation of his community at Lake Hills Church, and really the origins of Spur Leadership and how he's creating curriculum for youth, high school students, and also for entrepreneurs and business like-minded individuals out in the marketplace. Talk a little bit about his up-and-coming book and how he's working on his dates to get that written and get it published here in the next year. Exciting in the sense of what he's doing in the Austin area and how is he really forging relationships across the nation with key leaders and impacting America as a whole. He's got exciting things going on at Lake Hills. Check him out online, and let's get into this.
I'm Matt Grashord. I'm the pastor of Lake Hills Church here in Austin, and married for 25 years to my bride, Julie, and we've got two kids, both of whom are in college, so we're trying to figure out the empty nest right now.
Holy moly. I can't even imagine having a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old. I can't even imagine.
You're in the vortex right now.
Yes. That's one word for it. So, Mac, I don't know why this popped up for me, but what was your first job that you ever had?
That's a great question. The first job I ever had, I was a custodian at a kitchen design studio in Houston where I grew up. I worked for a guy, he owned a pretty successful business of designing and installing kitchens in people's homes, and their showroom had to be cleaned twice a week. And so the hours were kind of flexible. You could only do it when they were not in the office. And so that was my first job when I was in high school. After, I just remembered this, I also bagged groceries. I remember bagging groceries at Randall's grocery store in Houston.
What was it like growing up in your family when you were a kid?
You know what? It's funny. There's kind of a dividing line in my childhood. We had a really kind of leave it to beaver childhood early on. My mom and dad, my dad would get up and carpool downtown Houston every day. My mom held down the fort with my two brothers and me. And then when I was 12, my parents split up. And that was obviously kind of a dividing line and a marker of our home and childhood and that sort of thing. But even after my parents divorced, there was always kind of this sense of security and not necessarily knowing how we were going to figure it out and get through that, but I just kind of always knew that we would. And we had incredible support around us. My mom's parents lived in Beaumont, which was only 90 miles away, so they were around a whole lot. But then the people that we saw come alongside our family and just kind of support my mom, but also stand in as an example to my brothers and me and help out our family during that time was really pretty remarkable.
Mm-hmm. So you're a real ambitious guy. I just get that from you. And, for whatever reason it is, I'm curious to know what has driven and motivated you. But out of your ambition, your family getting into the marketplace and now, being a minister, what was your journey into university? Was getting into ministry a target for you?
It was something that began to kind of stir in me probably halfway late in high school. I didn't know for sure. I never, heard an audible voice of God or saw it spelled out in the stars or anything, but I remember, and it's interesting, my parents' divorce actually figured into that because I remembered, my dad kind of just hit the eject button and did a complete do-over when he was 40 years old. And so when I was in high school, I was getting ready to take the PSAT, which I knew was to take the SAT, which was to get into college, which was to get a job. So what do you want to do? And so I was, 15, 16 years old, and I started kind of thinking that through. And I remember thinking to myself, I'd love to, because I like people, I'm kind of full of it, I can talk, and I would love to do sales as long as the money's good enough. But because of what I had seen my dad go through and some of the choices he made, I knew that little phrase there, as long as the money's good enough, wasn't reason enough to get up and go every morning. And looking back on it, I think God really laid that into my heart at a time where I wasn't nearly smart enough to figure it out on my own. And so I started going, okay, well, what would you do if money were no object? If you made $1 a year or $1 billion a year, what would you love to do? And because of what I had seen in our church at home, Second Baptist Church of Houston, that was the only thing I could think of that I would love to do no matter what. I thought about coaching. I would have loved to have coached. But again, I knew that I spent more time with my coaches in high school than they spent with their families. And so I didn't want to make that sacrifice for coaching. I wasn't called to it. I didn't love it enough. And being a part of the church and the bride of Christ and moving that forward was something that God just kind of laid on my heart and was always there.
So you were working through this in college? Is when,
yeah,
or that was prior to
started in high school.
Okay,
but like I said, it was just kind of a tickling, if you will. I didn't know it for sure, and in college was when it was really confirmed. I went to school here at the University of Texas and worked, did a couple of different things. I worked at Shepler's Western Wear, shaping hats and selling jeans and all that kind of stuff. But then I got a position at Westlake Presbyterian working in the youth ministry. And just being a part of that, and it wasn't so much the students per se, but it was being a part of something that had an eternal significance. That was kind of the thing that pushed me over the edge and was like, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life, no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm. So was your schooling geared towards ministry, or was it in a different
No, initially
field?
I was a business major because, like I said, I wasn't positively convinced that I was called into ministry. And so my mom really encouraged me to kind of have a fallback plan in the event that I wasn't going into ministry. So I started out in business and did not do well academically. And statistics was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in the business school. Mm-hmm. And about that same time was when I God really confirmed my call to ministry. And so I switched from business into speech communications. I got a degree, I think it's called technically, it was OrgComm, Organizational Communications, which, I do every single day. I don't use a lot of what I got in college, but I do it every single day.
Absolutely. So we're going to fast forward to today,
mm-hmm.
okay, at Lake Hills Church. What is that environment? What does that look like with staffing, the community of members that go there?
Yeah, that is an ever-evolving answer, but that's part of the fun of it, too. I think we started in September of '97, so we just crossed the 19-year threshold, which is hard to believe, but it's true that Lake Hills Church has been in existence for 19 years. And the first 2 or 3 years of our existence were very dicey. I mean, it was very, very close whether or not Lake Hills Church was going to survive for the long haul. We didn't have a long runway. We didn't have a huge bankroll set aside to fund ministry, to pay my salary, or do any of those kind of things. But God was so faithful, just in incremental steps, which I look back on, and there were a lot of sleepless nights and a lot of uncertainty, but it was also a cultivation of a very real faith that God's brought us this far, and He hadn't brought us this far to leave us hanging. Mm-hmm. And so we started out in an elementary school cafetorium, just opened the doors, and we sent out a direct mail piece to about 10,000 homes. And just through the first 2, 3, and 4 years, it was very incremental, our growth and reaching people. We really felt a calling to redefine church for the city of Austin and beyond, and to do it differently, but to not water down the message and the hope of Christ, but to do it in a way that was compelling, hopefully creative and compassionate, but at the same time was reaching people that were not getting up and going to traditional established churches, and maybe had already done that, tried that, and had left that. And we saw just an incredible progression of God's faithfulness. And we moved into Westlake High School after a couple of years, and that was a significant moment just logistically. It was a little bit more stable. More people know where that high school is than they did the elementary school where we were meeting. And so we started to kind of grow in a little bit more exponential way as opposed to incremental. And then it's been an amazing ride. And so, like I said, we're here at 19 years, and the staffing component that you asked about is one that is one of those things that is never done. Mm-hmm. Like, there's always an opportunity for me to get better. There's always an opportunity for our staff to get better, and there's always issues because you're talking about people. And so there are always things that they're dealing with, even if they're doing a great job all the time, they've got family issues, they've got financial challenges, whatever, that I get to come alongside and help with. And so I think part of the fun of what I get to do is it's never the same day twice. And it's also one of those things that you have to be called to this or you'll go nuts. I mean, it's crazy on a regular basis, but it's okay if you're called to it.
You're not the first minister I've heard say that, so that's got to be true. So I want to look at a window of the inception of Lake Hills right before that. So, the year leading up to the creation or the launch to go in the cafeteria, what was, on you at that point, and what made you decide to start the community, and kind of what were those steps to getting it going?
So we had an incredible advantage because Julie and I got to serve on the staff at Fellowship Church in Dallas, where Ed Young is the pastor. And I had grown up at Ed's dad's church in Houston at Second Baptist, Dr. Ed Young, but we worked with Ed and Lisa Young at Fellowship Church in Dallas. And it was one of those things that was an unbelievable gift to get to be a part of, because Ed had moved to Dallas when Fellowship Church had about 150 people, and we got to be there on the ground floor, also in rented facilities, using a high school for worship services on the weekend and all those kind of things. And there was just this sense, and Ed and I talked very openly about when Julie and I started feeling a nudge, and Ed actually kind of precipitated it because they were getting ready to move into their building that they were in the process of building at the time. And he goes, Mac, I want to talk to you. He said, there's a place for you here, but I want to know if you want to go pastor somewhere, if you feel like that's where God's leading you, I'm all for it, but I need you to make a call. If you're going to be here, I want you to be here. And if you're not, I want to help you get to where God wants you to be. And so that really started Julie and me praying about it, thinking about it. And the more we thought about it, just functionally, the harder it became to leave Fellowship Church, because what was going on there doesn't happen on every street corner. And what continues to happen there, it's a very, very special place and a phenomenal church. Like I said, it started with about 150 people, and by the time we left in 97, there were 5,000 people showing up at a high school for church every weekend. It was crazy. But this was where God wanted us. And that was just the overriding leading and calling that we couldn't escape. And it was really funny because, here we are at CrossFit Central right here outside of I-35. I remember the day that we moved to Austin. We drove down. Emily was not quite 3 and Joseph wasn't yet 1 year old. And when we pulled into town on I-35 and went, and I just remember this as we went by Royal Memorial Stadium, I remember Julie and I both looked at each other and we said, we're home. This is where we're supposed to be. We had dated while I was in college here. She and I had started dating. She went to Baylor, but she was here in Austin more often than I was in Waco for understandable reasons. And we both loved this place, and we understand it and loved the people here, and just knew that this was where we were supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. So you bring up Julie. Yeah. Super powerful woman.
Very.
So tell me about y'all's relationship and her role within Lake Hills.
That's been a really interesting progression because, she grew up in South Mississippi, 2 sisters. I grew up in Houston, 2 brothers. And we actually met because her mom and Ed Young's mom are sisters. So she would come to Houston in the summertime to visit family, that sort of thing. So we always were hanging out. We knew each other. We were friends for 6 or 7 years before we ever started dating. But what that did was it kind of covered all of the dating preliminaries and any game playing that would have gone on that usually goes on when you start dating somebody. We didn't have to go through that because we already knew each other. We trusted each other. I knew her sense of humor. I knew her faith. All those things were already settled and taken care of. So when we started dating, we knew almost immediately that we were going to get married. Julie says, and I believe her. I don't mean Julie says this. I mean, Julie says that she knew we were going to get married 2 years before we started dating, which that pattern has held true throughout our marriage. She's usually about 2 years ahead of me. And I finally caught up, and we started dating, and dated for 2 years till I could get out of school and until she could finish enough schooling to start her student teaching. She was a special ed major, and she was able to do her student teaching in Fort Worth, where I was in seminary. So we got married that summer, and summer of 91, And then we were able to live in the same town because she could do her student teaching up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Mm-hmm. And her progression, she was intimately involved day one and before day one with Lake Hills Church. She ran our children's ministry because having a background as an education, a special ed major, and just also having a ridiculous gear for kids and how to connect with kids and minister to kids, but also to communicate to parents that this is a safe place, that you're okay dropping your kids off, especially for a brand new startup church that is, setting up and tearing down office cubicles for our childcare space in a gymnasium. She did an incredible job. And then as our kids got older and got into school and those kind of things, we actually, and as our church grew, they kind of coincided, and we were able to hire somebody to take Julie's place on the staff. As far as staff members, she was very unpaid the whole time that she was doing that in the early years of our church. And we actually had a public firing of Julie the day that we hired somebody to replace her, which the whole church celebrated. We as a family celebrated. It was a great day. But she really held down the fort and anchored our home in those early years when I was, pushing pretty hard, just getting the church to survive, or, hopefully pastoring and leading the church to survive. And then as our kids aged, her role really kind of changed. It's interesting when Emily got into elementary school and then Joseph came right behind her 2 years later and he started school, Julie kind of had it wasn't an identity crisis, but it was kind of like, man, my job just changed, because where I was going, 24/7 full court press, now they're gone for 8-9 hours a day. So what do I do? And that transitioned a little bit. Then when they got into high school, it transitioned even more. And now that they're in college, so as they have grown and gotten more independent, which is what you pray for and work for and hope to see happen, she's really stepped into more of a leadership role in our church. And she has, I would tell you, as strong a leadership voice in the decision-making and the leadership of our church as I do, because she's just so talented. And she's the smartest person I've ever met. She doesn't do it intentionally, but when you talk to Julie and she's always smiling, she's always in a good mood, and she's got that southern drawl, and people are like, oh, she's so sweet. And she is. And she is incredibly, incredibly tough and incredibly, incredibly smart and bright. She just has a wisdom to her that I'm an idiot if I don't pay attention to and seek out on a regular basis. And the good news is I don't have to ask her opinion too often. She's more than willing to share it.
That's great. So y'all, as a leadership within the church, do y'all have elders, or do y'all have a board, or how do y'all come to y'all's decision making now?
So the way we operate, and it's really interesting, Jeremy, because when we started, I did a long research on church governance. And what I found was that there are as many different models out there as you can dream up. And the Bible is, interestingly, I think, vague about how to structure a church. There are offices, there are elders, overseers, deacons, pastors, etc. But as far as checks and balances and how that works, and do you vote on this, do you not vote on that, or how does that work, there's not a lot of guidance biblically. And I don't think that's accidental. I don't think God left it out because of an oversight. I think it really is, it comes down to a heart issue. And for us, as we looked at the biblical record and the model that's portrayed in the New Testament, the word for elder, pastor, and overseer are used pretty interchangeably throughout the New Testament. But in the New Testament, they were the paid, what we would call staff, who oversaw the day-to-day ministries. And it says in the New Testament that they should be paid. Those who handle the word should be paid well, so that they are not entangled in civilian affairs like a soldier could get entangled in civilian affairs. Mm-hmm. So that's the model that we've adopted. Our pastors function as elders, and we've got two overlapping circles of leadership and responsibility is what it really comes down to. Our pastors that I lead oversee the day-to-day ministries, and we're a staff-led church, and we have a governing board of directors who provide financial and spiritual accountability and oversight. So, I think if a pastor runs off the rails, there has to be a mechanism in place to address that for the health and the safety of the church at large. And so we've got that, and there's a trust relationship there where, after 19 years, our church understands that nobody on our staff is getting wealthy doing what they're doing, but we believe in paying our staff well so that they can focus on the ministry and do their job well, and to honor and reward a job well done. Mm-hmm. But that's a reflection of responsibility that's attached to the role that you occupy on our staff, wherever you fall in that tree.
Mm-hmm. So this brings us to a good, I think, crossroads on your Spur leadership. Mm-hmm. And you're talking a lot about leadership and kind of a core message that you've embodied in the last few years. I mean, it seems like and you can speak to this, the Bible verse that kind of started Spur and
yeah, and it's interesting. I appreciate you asking about that, because to me, it's one of the most fascinating parts of the story of Lake Hills Church. And it's interesting how I think God orchestrated events and circumstances to birth the ministry that is Spur Leadership. And it flowed out of a couple of different things. Number one, about 7, maybe 8 years ago now, we began partnering with Mobile Loaves and Fishes here in town. Alan Graham and the group that they do, where you serve food to the homeless and the chronically poor day in and day out. And at this time, now we've got 2 trucks a day that we load up every day and send out with volunteers from our church. And it's one of the healthiest, most thriving ministries that we've ever gotten to be a part of. And we've gotten to be a big part of the Community First Project, where they're building a neighborhood to help homeless people transition out of homelessness and into having a place to lay their head and a community to be a part of. So that started about the same time that we went through a pretty significant season of transition on our staff. We had a number of people, some of whom were had pretty significant responsibilities, began transitioning off of our staff. Some by their own choice, some choices I helped them to make. But it was just a lot of change all at once. And our staff is very, very young relative to other churches and other businesses. And I was really looking for handles to help them process the transition, because it was disconcerting for me. And if you're 25 years old, just beginning your ministry, it can be kind of like, whoa, what's going on here? And it was about that time that I came across again Hebrews 10:24, where the Bible says, "Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds." And it was like all of a sudden that verse just jumped off the pages of Scripture and hit me between the eyes like a 2x4. I was like, that's it. If we can create a culture and cultivate that culture of love and good deeds, of really taking care of people and building a community of trust on our staff and throughout our church, but also make sure that we're getting work done, that we're actually producing good stuff rooted in love. That's the paradigm. I hate to call it a magic bullet, because there's nothing magic about it. It's prayer and sweat equity is all it comes down to. But that really kind of became the handles that we began attaching to every single thing that we do as a church. And it was really interesting, because we understand, in church world, at least conceptually, we understand that love is kind of where we start. Love God and love each other. We know, at least intuitively, that's what we're supposed to do. We don't always get it right, but we understand that. The good deeds part of that, the accountability, the responsibility, those conversations are a little tougher to come by and tougher to have when you love people and people are trying to be a nice person and a good guy or a good girl. But in the marketplace, the exact opposite is true. A lot of times businesses don't worry so much about loving and trusting. As long as you hit your numbers and you make your quarterly quota and you hit your numbers for the month, I don't care what you do. And you don't need to care about what I do. And in reality, we both need to do both well. And so that was kind of the birth of Spur Leadership, of spurring one another toward love and good deeds. And I visited with a good friend of mine who had been at a high-tech firm here in town for, at the time, 15 years. And he said, we do a good job on the good deeds portion of that. We hit our numbers and we're making money hand over fist. but we're not doing a good job of taking care of people. So when the cash flow slows and bonuses are cut, or the stock doesn't double every 6 months or split, we have people leaving in droves. And if we were taking better care of them, if they felt like we cared about them, they'd stick around through those seasons. So that kind of let me know we were on the right track. And so what we've tried to do is make Spur Leadership a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for people who can buy their own food. Just like we do for Mobilos and Fishes, we want to give people real handles that are rooted in Scripture, rooted in a relationship with Christ. But even if you don't believe in God, these things work every single time they're put into practice over time.
Mm-hmm. So with Spur Leadership, you have curriculum for high school students, and you also have your guest lunches and breakfast and bring in leaders. So tell us about that.
Well, and it's been really fun to see how this idea just started, 6 or 7 years ago, and then the different places that God has taken it since then. So we'll do events for marketplace leaders, coaches, police officers, et cetera, at our church 4 or 5 times a year. And it's a Spur Leadership breakfast series, and we'll bring in somebody like, Brian Bosworth. Some people were fascinated to hear his story because everybody remembers him as the Boz, but then he's got this incredible story of his transformation and what he learned, from Barry Switzer, who's not a Christian, but was a phenomenal leader. And so to hear that story was an incredible example. So we do these events from time to time, and then we host a conference every year in the springtime. But then one of the things that we noticed was that for high school students, there is an incredible opportunity, which at the time, we also kind of saw as a gap, where high school kids are not necessarily taught explicit leadership principles. And so if we could create something that gave them an opportunity to learn these principles, but also put them into practice and evaluate them and kind of grade them on how they do over the course of a semester in this program, they could walk away from that with, an incredible resume booster for when they apply to college, but also with some very real tools and practical tools of how they can use their leadership that they could use. And a lot of them get leadership by osmosis or kind of in the air that they breathe if they're a part of a football team or a part of a dance or a cheer squad or something like that. But as far as specific leadership training, there's not a lot out there for high school kids. And so we launched the Spur Leadership Academy for high school kids. And that's been, that was something that was born out of the mind of Alex Judd, who used to be on our staff. An incredible add to what we get to do as a church and Spur Leadership in particular.
Mm-hmm. So some of your leaders that you've had speak, because you have a pretty solid Rolodex of people that have come through. Yeah. I know we had Darren Roberts on here from University of Texas, phenomenal. Yeah. His story is great. But just a couple names, I want you to name drop a little bit about some of the guests that you've worked with and have interviewed.
It's funny, people, when we do one of these events, people, are like, man, thank you so much for doing it. And I have to be honest with them and say, this is one of the most selfish things I do, because I learn, I grow from the people that we bring in. And so it's fun for me to get to be a part of it and get to see these folks, build in. You mentioned Darren Roberts. Darren is one of those guys where when you sit down with him for about 2 minutes, his intellect and his heart both just come blazing through. And he was one of those guys. I went to lunch with him before he spoke at an event for us last spring, and it's been really cool just to see that friendship grow and develop. And we don't see each other that often, but when we do, it's like we pick up right where we left off. I think Buzz Williams, the men's basketball coach at Virginia Tech, when he spoke at our conference last year, he did a phenomenal job in his presentation. But the night before, he had done something pretty special. He spoke to a round table of pastors from across the country that we had in our home and just spoke out of his leadership experience as a basketball coach to how we lead as pastors. And it was a fascinating opportunity to learn because, you can go to a church or a pastor's conference every single week of the year and still miss half of the ones that are out there. But to listen to a guy who is a Christ follower, loves his wife and his kids, and is coaching at a very high level in an arena that we're not a part of every day, was just an incredible opportunity and very gracious on his part. He had it. We did the conference last year in April, and he had an 18-hour window because recruiting was getting ready to open up, and he had one event the night before, and he had to be somewhere the afternoon that he spoke. And he carved time out of his schedule in such an incredibly gracious way to be here and pour into those pastors especially, and then into the conference that day. So that's something and Buzz is one of those guys who is always giving. He's always giving. Even if he's just handing you a card that has a quote from John Wooden or Jack Welch or something on it, he's always giving. And so that's something that I looked at and I go, I need some more of that in my life. I want to be that kind of person. And as a result of that, you see his influence not only with his team, which is undeniable, and the kids that he coaches and recruits are really, really sharp young men, many of whom come from backgrounds without a father in their lives. Buzz is that guy. Mm-hmm. But to see somebody who's always giving like that, as his influence grows, he's never interested in building his platform. He's always interested in how can I help you? How can I serve you? How can I give you something? And as a result, his platform has grown and expanded exponentially, but it's only because he's genuinely serving. And I think that's one of the things, servant leadership gets talked about a lot, but in my experience and my observation, most people, when they talk about servant leadership, they talk about serving, but they never get around to actually leading. Buzz is one of those guys. He actually leads. He serves, but make no mistake about it, he leads. I mean, he pushes his guys hard, and they know what's required. They know what's expected. His coaches know that the bar is set very high, but he does it in such a loving way that they're okay. And not everybody's okay with that. Mm. And Buzz is fine with not everybody being okay with that. He knows that there's some people that are not going to thrive in that environment, but he's not willing to compromise where he sets the bar or how much he's willing to love and give to people. And that's one of the things that I think is a mark of an incredible leader.
So the next Spur Leadership Conference is in 2017.
Right, April the 28th. Marcus Luttrell, the lone survivor, is going to be our keynote speaker. And Marcus is a really interesting guy that Julie and I have kind of gotten to know over the last few years. His book Lone Survivor, that became the movie that Mark Wahlberg was in and everything, is a phenomenal book and an incredible story, obviously, of his capture and escape from the Taliban in Afghanistan. But I think Marcus's second book, which is entitled Service, is even better than the story of Lone Survivor, because the book Service talks about this calling to military service that Marcus and his twin brother Morgan have and had, and their experience in the Navy SEALs teams. But then like the last third or quarter of the book, he goes into vivid detail talking about the wives and the families of SEAL team members and how they are called to this and hold down the fort and sacrifice and serve every bit as much as those who are actually on the battlefield and in the front lines. And so I'm really excited about what Marcus is going to be able to speak into people's lives based on his experience and his observations. It's funny when you sit down with a warrior, which is what he is, and somebody who's been through what Marcus has been through, and you find out that he's also got the heart of an artist. Marcus writes every day. He's a writer. He's a thinker. He's a deep thinker. And so we're really, really grateful and excited about what he's going to be able to speak into the conference in April. Steve Price is Vice President of Human Resources for Dell Technologies worldwide. And Steve has such a unique perspective because he's been at Dell for so long. And yet, because of his skill and his gifts as a leader and as an administrator, he's responsible for how they deploy their people around the world. And I'm really excited that he's going to be a part of the conference as well.
Man, I mean, Dell as a whole is such a unique, amazing company. And I think that the perspective of them and we don't have to get into Dell and all that stuff, but I mean, just from the sense of people thinking it's a computer company,
right?
Which it's not. You know,
no,
and
that does them such a disservice.
The vastness of that business, and just what I understand from the recent, mergers or selling that occurred in the last 4 months, the biggest deals that Dell's done.
Yes.
And it's just amazing. Maybe we'll get Michael in here and he can tell us a little bit about what's going on.
It would be fascinating, I think, to be able to pick his brain. But you see, I think because we moved to town in like I said, in August of '97, and at the time, Dell was, just a hockey stick graph of their stock price and everything else that they were doing. And it's been fascinating for me because I'm always studying leadership, and I'm always studying environments and cultures and like what works there and what's not working here. And to see how they have genuinely grown in not just the size of the company, but they've grown in their understanding of how to take care of people. And they really are doing it at a massive, massive level. And I think, I've read where Michael and others have said before, we didn't do a great job of this years ago, but we're committed to it. And they've learned and they've grown and they've done that. And I think for Michael Dell in particular to literally go from a college kid assembling these things, but to remain and to grow into the role of a CEO of a multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporation, that shows an incredible, I think, humility to say, I need to learn. I need to put the right people around me that know what I don't know that'll get us to where we need to go. And so I've never met Michael, but I've learned from him and admired him from afar for a long time.
Absolutely. So, in conversations, and one thing for our listeners, Mac and I are good friends. We get to sit down for coffee and visit, every couple months or so. So
we're better friends since you quit training me. Because for a while I was kind of resentful of the punishment that you dished out whenever you worked me out.
Perfect.
But I got over it.
Good.
And I got better for it too.
Well, one of the things that you have said, and I've kind of picked up on, and some things that I think about and process through, is about the heart. And there's so much new data coming out of, I believe it's called Heart Meth, where they just study the frequencies of the heart and the connections of the heart and people coming into communication through their heart. And you're talking about heart issues.
Sure.
Or heart. So when you say it's a heart issue, or, I see people say lead from the heart, or, and so the heart is an organ, right? And so kind of we break that down in your perspective of what a heart issue would be and how you would describe it.
Well, that's a very broad question. I think everything's a heart issue. I really do. I think how I interact with my wife, why I say what I do, and why I say it the way I say it to her is probably the ultimate human heart issue that I have to pay attention to. But even down to how I prepare a sermon, okay? That's a heart issue. Am I doing this so that people walk out of Lake Hills Church and go, man, Mac Richard is the greatest preacher I have ever. If that's why I'm preparing, I'm dead in the water. If I'm preparing out of a sense of responsibility and a sense of calling to do what God's called me to do and to deliver the message that He wants me to deliver, then I'm light years ahead of the curve. And so for me, a heart issue comes down to really, I think it's always about motive, Jeremy. I think why do we do what we do? And that's probably the biggest question we ever ask. When our kids were little, I remember Emily especially, she was a why girl. She was always, why? The grass is green. Why? Well, because God made the grass green. Why? And it was just always why? And I think, I call that the battle of the why, because we always have to be examining our motives. I think it's imperative that we're always, and the Bible says to take every thought captive to Christ. So God, find any offensive way that is within me and flush it out so that you can do what you want to do in me and through me. And for that to happen, I've got to be brutally honest. I've got to have people in my life who are lovingly and brutally honest with me when they see something, something in me that needs to get better. whether it's, the Bible says iron sharpens iron, so one friend sharpens another. And, kisses from an enemy aren't anywhere close to wounds from a friend. A friend is willing to wound us from time to time for our own good and for our own benefit. And so you've got to have those people around you who are willing to hold you to account and shoot straight with you, who will tell you what you need to hear, not just what you want to hear. Because I think the heart of the matter, whether you're running CrossFit Central or you're the pastor of Lake Hills Church or you're a college student, it's always, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And I'll be honest, a lot of that, my conviction about that, I think, goes back to what I said at the very beginning of this conversation. My dad got up and went to work every single day and provided for our family. And I think when he got to a crossroads in his life, he didn't know why he was doing it. He had gone to, I think my dad got a business degree from the University of Texas because he thought his dad and my mom wanted him to. But that wasn't who he was. That was not feeding his soul. You know what I'm saying? And so you've got to figure out your why. Simon Sinek wrote that great book, Start With Why, that is there for business leaders and businesses. But I think before we ever get into the business world or leadership, we've got to answer that for ourselves. And I think that's why a relationship with God is the place to begin, because when you think about the fact that we're all created by God on purpose, for a purpose, if that's where we start, then everything else is a detail. Let's figure out where to go from there. But why am I here, and what does God want to do in me and through me? So that's why I say everything is a heart issue.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Well, moving into some straight questions. First one, what has been one of your biggest struggles, challenges, and how have you overcome that?
I've got two answers to that, if that's okay.
That's fine.
I am a big picture guy. I love the big picture. I like big patterns. I like kind of looking at things going, why is that going on? And then how does that apply over here? Which means I'm not good at details. That's not my strength and not my gift. And I have been slow to institute and reinforce systems and processes that allow our church to grow and to scale healthy. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So I'm having to drill down into some areas that are not real comfortable for me, but we need in order to get better. And I need in order to get better. So that would be that's the first one that comes to my mind. And I think just over the story of Lake Hills Church and my life in general, I think in general, I think betrayal is really hard. I think it's really hard when you trust somebody and that trust isn't returned. Okay? And a few years ago, General Tommy Franks spoke at the Spur Leadership Conference, and I had a chance to sit down and have a conversation on videotape with him. And the night before that conversation, I think we had like 45 minutes, maybe an hour with him, and I had about 2 hours worth of questions. And I was going to bed, and I asked Julie, I said, what's something you think I ought to ask General Franks about? And she said, ask him about betrayal. I thought, all right, that's a great question, because I don't know anybody who's ever led at any level who hasn't experienced betrayal. And I don't mean necessarily, it doesn't have to be intentional, mean-spirited betrayal. I'm talking about just disappointment in another person. That's just part of it. And so I asked General Franks this question. We'd kind of gone all the way through the interview, and I said, one last question. I said, in a career as long as yours, you probably, I would imagine, have experienced betrayal in some form or fashion. And Jeremy, when I said the word betrayal, he just kind of, all of a sudden his eyes just got really big, and he went, oh, yes. And you could tell, even this guy who had, who led the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11 and had so much responsibility for so many lives. He was retired by then, and it struck a deep chord within him. And he paused for a second, and he said, Mac, He said, there's only been one perfect leader that this world has ever known, and I am not he. And if he would experience betrayal, who am I to think that I should be able to escape it? Now, in that moment, everything made sense for me, because the message that I heard was, suck it up. It's a part of it. It is a cost of doing business, of leadership, that you're going to have to go through that. You're going to have to wade through that, and you're going to have to process it, but shake it off and don't let it bog you down. Don't let that slow down what God's trying to do in you and what he wants to get done through you. Process it and then shake it off and move on. And it was an incredible gift to me personally at that time that I didn't see coming. And it was just one of those things that was incredible. So I think, you asked biggest struggle. I think the details and the processes are hard for me, just functionally day in and day out. But then overcoming and getting through betrayal was something that probably candidly took me a little longer than it definitely took me longer than it should have. But General Franks was instrumental in helping me get through that.
That's great. Well, a man of pursuing, better practices of leadership and leading the church. What books and movies and podcasts do you listen to, and what do you really,
Man, I am always gathering and grazing information. That's one of the things I was so when I found out you were doing. I don't think you even told me. I think I saw on social media you were going to be doing the Amplify podcast. I was just like, there's another resource that I can use to grow and get better, because I know you well enough to know that you're gonna bring in here people that are actually doing this stuff day in and day out, and not just theorizing about it and not just talking about it. This year, two of the best books that I have ever read that have helped me in leadership and in pastoring were written by guys that are not connected to the church. The first one was the book Tribe by Sebastian Junger. To me, it's one of the most important books that's ever been written, because it traces everybody's need for connectivity, to know and to be known, and ultimately to love and to be loved. And Junger comes at it from the standpoint of an anthropologist and a reporter. So he traces it very, very matter-of-factly with I would say zero political agenda whatsoever. He uses some political examples, but he does it in such an even-handed way that it's never heavy-handed. But Tribe is a really, really good book. It's so good, I went to his book signing when he came to Austin and was at Book People that night. But he's a very gracious guy and very, very smart. He wrote the book The Perfect Storm that became the movie. He's nominated for an Academy Award for his documentary Restrepo about his time being embedded with Marines in Afghanistan. But Tribe, I think, it's one of the most important things I've seen. And then there's another book, Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday, who actually lives here in Austin. And I actually, in order for Emily and Joseph to get their allowance one month in college, I assigned them Ego is the Enemy, because I think if they could get the heart of that. And the interesting thing about Ego is the Enemy, Holiday uses a lot of different sources. He quotes C.S. Lewis, the Christian philosopher and scholar. He quotes Sun Tzu and The Art of War, uses William Tecumseh Sherman as an example. So he's got this incredible array of examples, the whole thrust of which is, it ain't about you. And Ego is the Enemy, I think, is one of the smartest titles I've ever seen in my life. But the message of the book is, subsume your ego for your own good, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but the way that he presents it is really, really helpful. And then, I do think there's a brand new book that I love that Mark Batterson, who's the pastor of National Community Church, wrote, called Chase the Lion. If your dream doesn't scare you, it's too small. And I love that. Mark does as good a job as anybody I know of combining spiritual truth and insight with practical application and and practice. And Chase the Lion is a great book. And so all three of those I'm ping-ponging on right now, just kind of processing through and going back and looking over my notes and my highlights out of all of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ryan has, one of our previous guests, Joa, had spoken highly of The Obstacle is the Way.
Yes.
And so I recently picked that one up, and the Chasing the Lion, I just opened that book up,
did you?
from you. And already within the first 15 pages, it's a very powerful book. So I'm excited about reading that. So moving on to our next question, what would be 3 tactical advice that you could give to an individual that they could apply immediately?
It's a great question. I think the first thing that I would tell you, that I tell myself, no matter what you do for a living in your life as an occupation, if you're a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad or a Fortune 50 CEO, the first thing I would encourage you to do is pray for wisdom. I think when you look at the array of choices that we all have to make in our lives every single day, wisdom and common sense from the heart of God is the greatest gift you could ever get. And common sense is highly uncommon. And and the Bible's really clear, if you pray for wisdom, God will give it to you. All you have to do is ask. He is the seat of all wisdom because he's the seat of all creation. He's the creator. He's the source. So if we want to understand how things work and how they work best and how we work best within everything he's created, ask for that wisdom. I think is first and foremost. Second thing I would encourage you to do, I would encourage you, read a lot. Read a lot. And I would encourage you to read a lot of fiction. Because I think fiction allows our minds and brains to go in places that we don't plan, which creates creativity. And some people say, well, I'm not a creative guy. I've never painted anything, or I'm not a sculpture girl or whatever. Nothing could be further from the truth. You know, we're all created in the image of God. And the first thing we know about God from Scripture is that God's creative. In the beginning, he created. So because we're all creative, we've all got opportunities to use that creativity. It doesn't have to be with paint or sculpting or anything else. You've got an opportunity to be creative. Julie, my wife, is one of the most creative people I've ever seen as a mom. She is so brilliant in the way that she parented and still parents our kids who are in college, but particularly when they were younger. She was always anticipating their need and their next move and trying and was 2 or 3 steps ahead of that. So she knew where they wanted to get to and where they were going. So she was always asking the question, praying for wisdom. How do I position this in a way that's going to resonate with a strong-willed little girl like Emily, an equally strong-willed son like Joseph, but he's just a little bit more laid back and hides it better than his sister did. So I think creativity coming from reading and enjoy movies. Movies are one of the things I love to do because I like to just get lost and just escape. It's one of those things I can do and not think for a while, but then my brain starts firing in unexpected ways. That is really, it's one of the best things that comes out of art, whether it's a book or a movie or going to a museum or something like that. And then the third tactical thing that I think is so important is look at the relationships around you, starting with the inner circle, the people that you're closest to. Do something today to build trust with those people in a way that resonates with them. Do something today that helps them know Matt cares. You know, this is somebody who really cares about me, not what I can do for him, but he cares about me. And that goes back to, you know, what we were talking about earlier with Buzz Williams. Buzz is one of those guys, he just gives. I get stuff in my mailbox once or twice a month from Blacksburg, Virginia. Buzz is sending me a Virginia Tech basketball golf shirt or a book that he's recently read or the cards that he's given out to his team that I never even asked for. They just show up. And again, I say, you know, that's one of those things I look at and I tell Julie this, I know I need more of that in my life. But I think when you do those kind of things, you get better and you do better, and it opens up a flow of generosity, not materially, but a generosity of spirit in every relationship you have, and that only helps everybody around you.
That's great.
It's hard to do, but it's awesome when it happens.
No, I like it. Well, so I know that you are currently working on a book.
I am.
So what's kind of, I know we're ahead of the game here, but give us a kind of a time frame, and do you have the title yet, or is that under wraps?
It's under wraps, and it's very much a work in progress. The time frame is, let's see, today as we sit here is October the 5th. I have to turn in 40 to 50,000 words on November the 1st, and I'm getting there. I'm pretty close to that. But I'm not home yet. So I've got some writing and then some serious editing to do before I turn in those pages. But it's been a fascinating process, Jeremy. I've always I feel like that's a part of my calling, is to write. I actually enjoy it, as hard as it is and as much of a grind as it is. I really enjoy it because I like words, and I love compiling stories and using Scripture references here, but then also stories from, whether it be from people that I know in the marketplace or in athletics or church or whatever. I've enjoyed the process, and I will be thrilled when this expression of the process is over. Mm-hmm. But it's been really interesting, and it's something that I've had to remember. I'm layering this into my day job as a pastor. I'm not primarily a writer, so it's kind of had to, it happens where I can squeeze it in and make it happen. But I do enjoy it. It's been fun.
Okay, so if people want to find you online and kind of get involved in Spur Leadership and things like that, where can they find you?
First place to find would be Lake Hills Church, just lhc.org. But then we also have a website for Spur Leadership, spurleadership.com. And we've got, events coming up that we're very excited about. Again, because of, and this is something we really do work on and think about, what are we going to be able to give the people who come to these events? So that's the thing that's most exciting, is when people go, this thing's at a church, but like I was able to walk out of there and really use something when I got back to the office that morning or that afternoon. That's to me where the magic happens, and that's where it gets really, really fun. So lhc.org and spurleadership.com is where we are most of the time.
And your next breakfast is, when's the date of that, and who's your guest?
October the 28th, Friday, is Chad Hennings, former Dallas Cowboy, 3-time Super Bowl, and an Air Force combat pilot. Clear underachiever in life, but Chad's an incredible guy with a great story. But ever since he retired from the NFL in the 90s, he's also been an entrepreneur in the Dallas area, and so he understands leadership at the highest levels, where the stakes are the highest, and what it's like starting a business and getting it off the ground from scratch. Obviously, admittedly, with an advantage of having, the name Chad Hennings and being a former Dallas Cowboy, but he's still got to make it work and make it produce. And so we're excited to have him October the 28th for breakfast.
Nice. Awesome, Mac. Well, we appreciate you coming on.
Jeremy, thank you so much. It's been an honor. I appreciate it very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for joining us on the Amplify Podcast. You can find more at theamplifypodcast.com. Our social links to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Join us in conversation. Let us know what you're thinking and how we can best service you guys. We will see you again really soon.